How does a revolution die? Slowly, painfully, one man at a time. January 10th, 1778. A young soldier stands convicted. His crime, desertion. His likely motives for running away,
is hereby declared.
A square meal and a chance to see his family.
Place the accused on the wagon.
Most of the soldiers here are his age, in their 20s. Hundreds like him will run away, turn their backs on a lost cause.
Desertion was the death of the army.
And desertion is about to be the death of an infant nation. For the man who ordered the execution, it's a day of reckoning.
The revolution was in chaos. The army was demoralized by the feeling that the people no longer supported them.
For the leader of the army, it's time for a grim reality check. It's all on the shoulders of a man who seems hopelessly out of his depth, a man named George Washington. Washington will wind up at the end of a rope, a British rope himself, unless he gets help. He bets America's future on a long shot, a hot-headed warrior from the old world that some call an imposter. December 19th, 1777. Meet General George Washington, loser. In just 3 months, he has lost 3 catastrophic battles in a row. Soon, even the founding fathers are on the run.
They had been trying to stop the British from seizing Philadelphia, which was basically the capital of America, because the Continental Congress was meeting there. And yet it didn't work. They had to fall back, and the British occupied the capital, and the Continental Congress had to flee like refugees in the night.
Signing their names to the Declaration of Independence has condemned them to death for treason against the crown. As commander-in-chief, George Washington's name would probably top the executioner's list. Now, he retreats with only 12,000 troops to a forlorn piece of real estate 20 miles from Philadelphia, known as Valley Forge. What he doesn't know is that more of his men will die here than in any battle of the Revolution. And for those who do survive, the cruel months awaiting them will put their loyalty to the ultimate test. And yet somehow, in a way that astonishes historians to this day, Valley Forge will spark a miracle, which literally forges a nation. To discover what made a miracle tick, scientists dissect the legend at Valley Forge National Park near Philadelphia.
Every excavation that is done here, every bit of this past that is so critical to the understanding of our republic.
Archaeologist David Orr has spent 25 years exploring hallowed ground to unearth the magic of this time and place. Sometimes even the smallest artifacts loom large. In this case, a British button has a lot to say about American ingenuity.
Yeah, this is a British regimental button, and it's not just the only one we found. We found a lot of them here. 8th Regiment, King's 8th Regiment button. We suspect that the Continental Army was recycling British uniforms, and this is clear evidence of that.
The evidence suggests that Americans were stealing the redcoats off the British and dyeing them to make them their own. Too bad they can't steal the Brits' spit and polish on the battlefield. Since the summer of 1776, the British Army descends on the colonies with a vengeance. King George unleashes a massive invasion to crush America's rebellion. 300 ships, 30,000 troops, the full force of the most powerful nation on earth. Leading the Americans against the onslaught is a man who at least looks the part. He never chopped down the cherry tree or threw a silver dollar across the Potomac. Those were myths invented later. But except for his false teeth, everything else about George Washington is the genuine article.
This man was in his prime. He was in his mid-40s. He was 6'3", muscular. He was almost unique. He was a giant, which is, makes for him look like a commander.
Washington is literally larger than life. But as a military strategist, some of his own people think he's no mental giant. Before the war, George was a gentleman farmer who hadn't seen combat for 17 years. But now, he's against the best of the best. Washington doesn't just have the Brits to worry about. His own commanders outshine him. After his rival, General Horatio Gates, wins a stunning victory over the British at Saratoga, Dr. Benjamin Rush, one of Washington's critics, nails it.
I have heard several officers who have served under Gates compare his army to a well-regulated family. The same gentlemen have compared General Washington's imitation of an army to an unformed mob.
Calling America's first GIs a mob seems like a compliment, as Washington's army limps into Valley Forge in December of 1777.
The morale of the Continental troops when they came to Valley Forge couldn't have been lower. They were very, very tired soldiers. And if you marched over the bad roads of the period, your shoes just fell apart within a couple of days.
Private Joseph Plum Martin of Connecticut remembers the agonizing march to Valley Forge.
I made myself a pair of moccasins, which kept my feet from the frozen ground. The only alternative was to go barefoot, as hundreds of my companions had to, till they might be tracked by their blood upon the rough, frozen ground.
Among the exhausted new arrivals at Valley Forge, archaeologist Julia Steele's great-great-great-grandfather.
My ancestor, William Raymond, was in the Connecticut line of the Continental Army. It's hard for me to even imagine what my ancestor would have experienced here.
Luckily for Steele and the team here, the sufferings of ordinary soldiers find a voice in the journal of Private Joseph Plum Martin.
It was dark. There was no water to be found, and I was perishing with thirst. I lay here 2 nights and 1 day, and had not a morsel of anything to eat.
To the troops arriving that day, Valley Forge looks like George Washington's worst idea yet. Historian Thomas Fleming has analyzed the impact on morale.
There was nothing there. The place looked to them like the worst possible choice for a winter camp. And the average soldier must have thought, my God, what's wrong with George Washington?
Only now, by analyzing the evidence in depth, does David Orr find that there was a method to George Washington's seeming madness.
Washington selected this site, first of all, because of the nature of the land itself. There was a rise, easily defensible, and he had the river to his back.
Washington orders his men to build huts out of logs, primitive structures, now being excavated for the first time by archaeologists.
No, you need just a little more work. That's just a little more troweling here. We want to see this arch. Clean that separation line. I want to get that line clear.
Finally, after over 200 years, the foundations of the huts that once housed the Pennsylvania Brigade come to light.
So my colleagues here are digging just about the edge of the hut's side where a log wall would be.
Despite the death, horror, and hardships, David Orr thinks the discoveries suggest a carefully planned community.
Washington was a great leader. The archaeology reflects that, because the archaeology does not show chaos here. The archaeology shows order.
The excavations pinpoint, for the first time, the precise locations of the barracks. They match up exactly to Washington's designs. 18 feet by 16 feet, 12 men per cabin.
So you can imagine huts, maybe 2,000 huts, in farm fields, straight as arrows, lining the countryside, with fires. An amazing scene.
During the winter of 1777 into 78, This now empty landscape was home to up to 15,000 people, making it the 5th biggest settlement on the continent. At the dig site, archaeologist David Orr has analyzed the living conditions.
These must have been miserable places. They weren't adequately drained. They had to constantly struggle to get dry clothes because they'd be saturated with the wet.
Temperatures hover below freezing. Warm clothes are so scarce, soldiers must pool all they have to lend to the unlucky grunt assigned to sentry duty in the snow. The camp is awash with mud and sewage. Cholera and typhoid sweep through the ranks.
Throughout the 6 months of the encampment, it's estimated that somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 soldiers died, much more than any battle of the Revolution.
And yet today, not a single trace of a human body has been discovered.
We have archaeological evidence of no graves. There may be a few graves here, it's hard to be sure, but there's certainly no cemetery, no military cemetery. And there was no desire by Washington to do such a thing.
At Valley Forge, it's George Washington's duty to hide the painful truth from his men. But Washington hides nothing from the Continental Congress. The commander-in-chief lays out the options in stark terms.
I am now convinced, beyond a doubt, that unless some great and capital change suddenly takes place in that line, this army must inevitably be reduced by one or other of these 3 things: starve, dissolve, or disperse.
To make Valley Forge succeed, a man renowned for his honesty is about to discover he must become a master of deception. January 1778. As the temperature plummets, an army of amateurs from 13 squabbling colonies seems ready to self-destruct. One soldier, Joseph Plum Martin, sizes up his detachment.
The regiment that I belonged to was made up of about 1/2 New Englanders, and the remainder were chiefly Pennsylvanians. Sets of people as opposite in manners and customs as light and darkness. Consequently, there was not much cordiality existing between us.
We tend to think of the American army in the Revolution as all basically of English descent. But this simply wasn't true.
It's not just an army of locals. The Revolution has drawn idealists and adventurers from all over the world.
The Irish comprised, by a rough estimate, about 30% of the troops in Washington's army.
Germans, Poles, and especially Frenchmen swell the ranks. And so too does another group, eager to join the struggle.
Eventually, 1 out of 7 of the soldiers in Washington's army were black, and it was an integrated army. They lived with the whites. They weren't segregated in any way, shape, or form.
It would not be until the Korean War that American forces would be integrated again. White or black, native or foreign-born, the combined needs of 15,000 men are enormous.
For 3 months in Valley Forge, they needed 7,000 head of cattle and 17,000 barrels of flour. It was staggering to think of how much food they needed. He wrote letters to Congress, which are among the most vivid letters that any general ever wrote about the condition of his men.
Gentlemen, as you were.
Washington spells it out for the Founding Fathers.
Naked and starving as they are, we cannot enough admire the incomparable patience and fidelity of the soldiery.
We know they weren't naked, but starving? How much did his troops really have to eat? At Valley Forge today, David Orr and his team intend to find out.
If you look at the soil itself, you can see it's a reddish soil. That's what happens to the soil when it's burned. You can see the stone hearth. When we excavated it, we found the remains of animal bones. We saw how they were cut. We saw how they were prepared. You know, they're boiled.
We have all the standard large farm animals, cattle, sheep, pigs, goats.
Forensic expert Pam Crabtree has analyzed the bones.
Yeah, here's a piece of a pelvis, and we can see the piece of the chop mark right here. And that's not surprising, because it looks as if many of the animals were driven into the camp and then slaughtered, butchered, cooked, and consumed on site. No wild animals either. No deer, even though they're all over the park today.
The Americans were expert marksmen. If they were truly starving, why weren't they hunting for food?
There they were able, among their mates, to sit and enjoy a fairly substantial meal. Maybe not as frequent as they'd like, but a fairly substantial meal.
Valley Forge was hurting for supplies. These guys ate every piece of the animal, head and feet included. But starving? Some experts believe Washington was strategically stretching the truth a yard or two. Shocking.
At Valley Forge, the Army had, you might say, a publicist, a supreme and very superior publicist. His name was George Washington. He called them naked and starving. Now that, at times, was something of an exaggeration.
Anything to provoke a response, to get what he needed for his men.
Washington was a master of getting from Congress what he needed to keep this army in the field.
If Washington bent the truth to raise support for his men, he outright lied to the British by leaking disinformation in dispatches he knew would fall into enemy hands.
Sirs, it is with great encouragement that I write to inform you that our army has drastically improved. With the arrival of the New Jersey militia, our numbers of enlisted regiments has just reached 40,000 fully uniformed.
He personally wrote out in his own handwriting the returns of the Army, in which they listed how many men in each brigade and so forth. He quintupled them all. And then he arranged for one of his double agents to take it in, and he gave it to General Howe. And Howe was so ecstatic because he looked and he recognized Washington's handwriting. And then they read these returns. They said, "Oh my God, I had no idea Washington's army was this big." And that was another reason why Howe decided not to attack Washington, because he thought Washington had 30 or 40,000 men out there.
Washington scams the British, when at this point he may only have as few as 5,000 troops. But he can't hide the cold realities from his own men. They desert at an alarming rate.
1 out of every 10 members of the Washington's army while he was at Valley Forge deserted. That's a pretty high percentage.
January 10th, 1778. 3 men stand convicted of desertion. Washington must make a terrible choice.
Is cavalry declared?
To show mercy or set an example.
He didn't like to hang people. But if a man was caught deserting, say, twice or 3 times, there's a very strong chance that he would be court-martialed, and it had to be dealt with very firmly. And there were men that were hanged at Valley Forge for desertion.
Washington pardons 2 of the 3 men. But for John Riley, a soldier from Washington's home state of Virginia, there will be no more reprieves. While his soldiers are leaving in droves, another group at Valley Forge works against Washington from within. His own officers. Near the camp kitchens, archaeologists excavate a hut different from the others. The layout is more spacious, the structure more substantial.
This is a very typical officer's hut here at Valley Forge. Quite spacious, well preserved, but in this special place, we're getting a glimpse of all sorts of other activity. This is a shoe buckle, which would be typical for a continental officer, part of his ornamental assemblage, probably made out of brass.
While the grunt troops make do with homemade shoes and stolen uniforms, many officers enjoy the comforts of home.
We have seen wine bottles, we have seen tea bowls, wine glasses. This place really shows the difference between officers and enlisted men.
Officers big on ego badmouth their leader. A certain Colonel Pickering takes a potshot.
Before I came to the Army, I entertained an exalted opinion of General Washington's military talents. But I have since seen nothing to enhance it.
Yielding to the negative reports in the Continental Congress, John Adams, once a Washington fan, caves in.
We must have another leader. General Washington is no longer able to hold our little army together.
Washington was indeed on political thin ice, and he knew it.
According to American legend, this is about the time when George Washington gets on his knees in the snow and prays. It's an inspiring story and a memorable image. But some experts doubt it ever happened.
I don't think Washington prayed at Valley Forge. He was not a praying man. The God that he worshipped was not a God to whom you prayed. He was the ruler of the universe, but not a God who interceded in human affairs.
Whether George Washington prayed at Valley Forge or not, the answer to the prayers of a new nation is on its way, and from a most unlikely place. 2.5 years into the Revolution, conditions at Valley Forge are worse than ever. Washington himself visits dying troops in makeshift hospitals scattered around the camp.
At one point, there were as many as 2,500 to 3,000 men who were listed as too sick to report for duty.
Surprisingly, archaeologists today believe that the hospitals were deliberately located to make them not convenient to the troops.
And it's a good 400 meters from the rest of the huts. At that time period, the poor sick soldier would have been carried in the middle of the night to a hospital hut with other dead and dying people.
Why would Washington build hospitals so far from his men? Archaeologists have come up with an intriguing theory.
Washington wanted to segregate the sick for morale purposes so that the well soldier would not have it weighing on their mind looking at ill comrades or your dying comrades.
February 10th, 1778. The morale of George Washington and his men is about to get a shot in the arm with the arrival of a long-awaited guest.
There's one more item I want you to take care of personally, and that... Welcome to you. How are you, my dear?
She has risked capture by the British to be with her husband.
I will tell you, you are a sight for sore eyes.
They really did love each other, I think. But she also knew that she added a dimension to Washington's life. But Martha would come to these sick soldiers and do her best for them. She'd bring food from headquarters, wine, little touches of things like that that made them feel a little better.
Martha tends to the sick and even knits socks for the troops. But just as Martha works wonders for the soldiers' morale, so another new arrival is about to give them badly needed backbone. February 23rd, 1778, a stranger arrives at Valley Forge. George Washington considers him so important that he rides out to meet the man in person. Sent here by Benjamin Franklin, America's chief diplomat in France, the stranger is an unlikely volunteer.
Welcome to Valley Forge, General. Pleasure to see you.
His name, Baron Friedrich Wilhelm Augustus von Steuben, a lieutenant general in the mighty Prussian army of Frederick the Great.
Now, Frederick the Great was the most famous soldier of his day, and his army was considered the best army in Europe. So anybody that could say he was a lieutenant general got immediate attention anywhere in the world.
Years later, an eyewitness still remembers the impact of von Steuben's arrival.
Never before or since have I had such an impression of an ancient fabled god of war. The trappings of his horse, the enormous holsters of his pistols, his large size, and his strikingly martial aspect.
Von Steuben speaks no English, Washington no German. An aide helps translate, and Washington soon finds that in military matters, they speak the same language. The commander-in-chief asked von Steuben to review the troops. After a quick inspection, his verdict cuts to the bone.
He inspected everything, and he saw what was going on and so forth. And then he came back and gave Washington a devastating critique of the way things were being run. Von Steuben was appalled to discover that the officers in the American army did not drill their troops.
Halt, damn it, halt!
The idea they had of their duty was only to put themselves at the head of their regiment when they were going into action.
Von Steuben knows he has to turn the army around. But how? He later writes,
Matters had to be remedied, but where to commence was the great difficulty.
with Washington's blessing, the Prussian takes charge of 100 men, an elite unit he will train to his high standards.
Achtung! Attention! Nach!
Without speaking a word of English, von Steuben knows how to get his soldiers' attention.
You can see why he attracted crowds from all over Valley Forge to watch it, because it was a great show. He was not at all above losing his temper. He was a classic drill sergeant.
Shoulder! Shoulder! Look!
He'd throw his hat on the ground, and he would explode with these incredible curses in German and French. The curses weren't translated because they didn't need to be translated. And then when he picked up a few English curses, he threw them in too. But the amazing thing was that they didn't resent it.
Quickly, the Prussian earns the troops' respect. But the soldiers impress von Steuben as well.
Shoulder! Shoulder!
He writes in a letter that reflects it best to a friend of his. With a Prussian soldier, you can tell him, grab that shovel, dig that hole, and he'll do it, without question. You say the same thing with an American soldier, he's gonna look you dead in the eye and say, why?
Von Steuben concentrates on teaching the awkward Americans how to handle their muskets with European finesse.
Oh, wow, look at that. Look at that.
Hey, check that out.
There we go. That's the hammer and cock assembly from an English flintlock musket.
Most likely a captured English musket that Americans were training with under von Steuben.
Good example. That's superb. Every soldier would have had one of these.
For a soldier in combat, the number of seconds it takes to load and fire one of these flintlocks spells the difference between life and death.
Ready? Ready.
Preach it.
Time is of the essence. A soldier would have a pre-made cartridge. He'd take the cartridge out of his pouch,
Bring the cock to half cock, move the frizzen forward. Withdraw paper cartridge, bite the end of the cartridge off. Prime the pan by placing powder in the pan, and then close the frizzen down on top. Placing the cartridge in the ball in the muzzle, drawing the rammer, ramming cartridge, replacing the rammer into the thimbles. Full cock.
The thought is to fire as fast as you can at the enemy because that is a way of keeping them from firing as fast as they can on you. To accomplish that, all soldiers in that line have to be working in unison together, to be able to fire together, to be able to load rapidly, to load, aim, and fire in unison. This is a very tough thing to do. Soldier has to be able to do it automatically. It's like breathing.
All right, shoulder, firelocks. Order. Firelocks. 1, 2.
prior to the training at Valley Forge, and it would take him about 30 seconds to load a musket. Von Steuben got that down to a military procedure and was able to take that down to 20 seconds. Now I'm going to time you. Doesn't sound like a lot of time, 10 seconds. When you're on the receiving end of a bayonet charge, 10 seconds becomes an eternity. "20 seconds exactly."
This is where von Steuben taught Washington's men the art of being a soldier. Above all, build teamwork, you build morale. And that's what von Steuben did here.
Firelocks.
Just as Washington is starting to see results under von Steuben's direction, he hears disturbing gossip. Some whisper that the Baron is not as advertised. that he's not a baron or a general at all.
His highest rank in the Prussian army had been captain.
So who was responsible for fudging von Steuben's resume? Historians believe it was none other than Benjamin Franklin himself.
Ben was very shrewd politician, and he had inflated the credentials that he was sending von Steuben to America with. He called him a lieutenant general in the army of the King of Prussia.
But while his credentials may be fraudulent, there's nothing phony about his training skills. And now it's time for phase 2, spreading the word.
He asked for 100 men that he would drill into what he called a model company. In other words, he didn't try to drill the whole army, which would have been impossible. So then he took the people who were in the model company and he distributed them throughout the army.
Working as von Steuben's disciples, 100 trainees must now translate his techniques for 12,000 Americans. For the first time, the Continental Army marches in step. 200 years later, archaeologists have found a remarkable symbol of that moment.
I've always thought of this button as the real beginning of the revolution. This button says USA.
A United States Army button. The first time the letters USA appear on a uniform. A symbol of the new spirit uniting the Army.
Inextricable. The U blends into the S, and the S blends into the A. United States of America, something new. No number telling you where you fit in the scheme of things. None of that. None of that.
May 5th, 1778. Von Steuben shows off the results of 2 months of constant drilling on the parade ground. Washington announces his verdict.
The Commander-in-Chief takes great pleasure in acquainting the Army that its conduct yesterday afforded him the highest satisfaction.
Washington's trust in the counterfeit baron has paid off. And news is about to arrive, which will turn the whole war around.
It was just an amazing burst of joy, excitement. People danced around, hugged each other.
Good news reaches Valley Forge at last. Ben Franklin's diplomacy in Paris has finally paid off. The French have committed to join America in the war.
I do not speak French very well, but I believe in light of this historic day, the correct thing to say would be Vive la France!
For this to be announced to these men was like the sun coming up and staying up for the next 10 days. The war was transformed from a colonial revolt to a world war. Now, France was the number 2 power in the world at this time.
Celebrating the alliance with France, for once the button-downed Washington ties one on.
Washington celebrated that day by promising each one of his brigade commanders that he would have a toast with them. The thing is, Washington had quite a few brigade commanders here. So by the time he was done with that, let's say Washington was basically feeling no pain.
Washington has reason to celebrate. He knows now it's the British who will be under the gun.
You see this powdery white substance? The Brits value it as much as they do their American real estate. No, this stuff isn't what you might think. It's sugar. England has cashed in on the world's sweet tooth with sugar produced in their Caribbean colonies. But now they fear Washington's French allies will seize the islands.
They had to defend the West Indies at all costs. They immediately sent orders to the British Army saying they had to detach a hefty percentage of the army, about a third of the army, had to be detached to the West Indies.
The British pull out of Philadelphia to join their troops in New York. Washington sees his chance and goes for it. After 6 months at Valley Forge, he puts everything his troops have learned to the test.
This is the first Revolutionary War battlefield in the country ever to be excavated.
Monmouth Battlefield in Freehold, New Jersey is the site of that pivotal battle.
And to the south, down...
Archaeologist Dan Sivelich looks for hard evidence that the training at Valley Forge paid off in combat.
All right, what we're looking for today up here is military ordnance. We're looking for lead canister shot, lead musket balls, and of course our iron grape shot.
The project has taken over 13 years, with over 80 volunteers scouring more than 1,500 acres of farmland for clues to what really happened here.
Artifacts are fun to dig out of the ground, but by themselves really don't mean anything unless you can interpret what the relationship is between a number of artifacts in the field.
In the field, flags mark the precise location of every object. In the lab, each discovery forms part of a vast database connected to custom-designed CAD software.
CAD stands for computer-aided design, and this gives us an idea of what's going on out in the field.
The computer calculates the firing range of each cannon to recreate a precise map of the battlefield.
What we are looking at here are all of the military artifacts found in the area that we were searching earlier. And what we see is something happened here. There's a large conflict of activity going on here.
June 24th, 1778, Hopewell, New Jersey.
Gentlemen, I have called this council of war to discuss the feasibility of attacking Clinton's troops in New Jersey.
Planning for the battle, Washington finds himself in conflict with his own officers. Topping the list, General Charles Lee, a former lieutenant colonel in the British Army.
He envied General von Steuben. He didn't like the way Washington had moved so close to this man.
As you all may be aware, I firmly believe it is time to attack.
Lee is Washington's number 2 and a bitter rival. Lee isn't buying that von Steuben's training at Valley Forge has turned the army around, and he's convinced that Americans will never stand up to the British in a head-to-head fight. June 28th, Monmouth, New Jersey. At 5 a.m., Washington's spies send word. 2,000 redcoats lag behind the main British army. Washington orders Lee to engage the enemy. He's about to find out whether Lee's low opinion of his troops might just be right. It's almost noon, 96 degrees in the shade. Washington listens for the heated clash of battle, but all he hears are a few lukewarm potshots. By mid-afternoon, he runs into his own troops, moving away from the action.
Boys, step forward.
Yes, sir.
Under whose command are you?
General Lee, sir.
Then what, may I ask, are you doing walking in this direction?
He orders us to retreat, sir.
That is a bold-faced lie and cowardice. Arrest this deserter.
No, sir, he
How many more?
When he spots one of Lee's colonels heading away from the enemy, Washington has seen enough.
What is the meaning of this retreat? Sir? The meaning
Stop
of this
the
retreat?
picture. I don't want you to miss this one. The father of our country is now so angry that according to some historians, he actually swears. You may want the kids to leave the room. Okay, George, go ahead, sorry.
Damn him!
Yeah! Yeah!
What we know for sure is that Washington takes charge himself. Suddenly, the redcoats are on top of them. It's a moment one eyewitness, the Marquis de Lafayette, will never forget.
General Washington seemed to arrest fortune with one glance. His presence stopped the retreat. I thought, then as now, that I had never beheld so superb a man.
So Washington simply takes over. He directs a couple delaying actions, and then Washington rides back to the hill that's about 500 yards over there and starts to lay out the defensive line along the ridge.
Now, British grenadiers advance relentlessly into a thicket called the Point of Woods. They pull out a weapon the Americans fear even more than British gunfire.
This is a soldier's bayonet. This is an original from the Revolutionary War. You have to put a foot on your enemy to push him off of it to get him out. And this bayonet would also be outlawed later on in history because a triangular bayonet creates a wound which is not easily repaired and sewn.
For the Americans, it's the most dangerous psychological moment of the battle, and the British expect the Yanks to crack.
This was the soldier's intimidating weapon. So there is a psychological impact that goes with that. They're going to see you coming at them with bayonets fixed. Not a pretty sight. You want to stick around and find out if they know how to use them? Probably not. The urge would be to skedaddle to the rear.
Up until this time, They had no skill with the bayonet, and bayonet charges by the British had frequently sent them fleeing.
But that was then, and this is now. Archaeologists have found evidence of the sacrifices the Americans make that day.
This is a musket ball that a soldier popped into his mouth when people were being operated on or just in terrible pain. To keep from chipping their own teeth or biting their tongue, they would put a musket ball between their teeth and bite down on it. That's where the expression "bite the bullet" comes from. And this is a musket ball that was absolutely flattened by someone in excruciating pain.
Americans bite the bullet, hold their ground. Von Steuben's lessons have stuck.
This was one of the crucial moments of the American Revolution. They met them bayonet for bayonet, and there was these tremendous clashes all over the battlefield. And some of their officers came right into the mouths of the American guns and were shot dead. And their soldiers followed them. The next thing you know, the British were retreating. But they could not break the American line.
This deadly skirmish buys George Washington precious time to set up his artillery on the high ground. The cannons pound the British troops. It's the longest field artillery duel of the entire war. In the 3-hour clash, thousands of rounds are fired.
This is the area where the 42nd Regiment was getting shelled very heavily by the American artillery. The artillery line was behind me about 800,000 yards, approximately where in front of the tree line there.
Archaeologists have found dozens of cannon shots and studied their blast patterns.
We can see an absolute amazing blast pattern from the guns into the orchard. 73.4. Right now we're looking at the 2-ounce grape shot blast pattern from the American artillery line into the orchard where the 42nd was.
And they fired 3 rounds of grape shot, bags of kind of giant steel ball bearings like this. So imagine bags of this burning as they came out of the muzzle of the gun, and then this handful of iron balls just hissing towards you.
The evidence provides intriguing clues to a legendary figure who may have fought here. A gun that may well have been manned that day by a figure known to legend as Molly Pitcher.
Molly Pitcher, because of running water back and forth to the artillery pieces as well as to the thirsty soldiers.
Here you go. I got some water. Anybody want?
Dan Civilich believes Molly's real name was Mary Hayes. According to legend, when her husband falls to enemy fire, Molly Pitcher steps in.
She took a gun position, running ammunition from the gun box up to the muzzle of the gun.
Eyewitness Joseph Plum Martin picks up the story.
A cannon shot from the enemy passed directly between her legs, carrying away all the lower part of her petticoat. Looking at it with apparent unconcern, she continued her occupation.
Just how much of the Molly Pitcher legend is true remains a source of controversy. But the heroism of the Continental Artillery, Pennsylvania Brigade, is beyond dispute. American cannons zero in on the elite British 42nd Regiment, known as the Black Watch. Among the most feared soldiers in the British Army. But the British regiment will flank the American artillery, unless Washington's snipers can pin them down first. American sharpshooters have been carefully positioned on the Monmouth battlefield. But can they stop Britain's elite Black Watch? For the first time, scientists can measure the damage the snipers could have inflicted. A tight cluster of 60 caliber musket balls, proof of marksmen with firearms experts believe were made in America.
Something very feared by the British was the American rifle. You have snipers with American rifles, which are deadly at 200 yards. Probably have a soldier firing down the diagonal of the trees at specific targets. And they're sitting out there just trying to pick off anything that moves.
How effective were they? Experts believe this button was most likely worn by a member of the British 42nd.
And as you can see, there's a section that's sheared off, nice and round sheared off, which indicates it was probably hit by a musket ball. The force of this ball was from back to front, which means that the soldier was wearing it, was hit in the back, and the projectile came through his body and out the front and through the button. The button was the last thing hit. Chances are the soldier who got hit with this did not survive.
They're finding the American snipers fired a deadly kind of musket ball they didn't even know was used in the Revolutionary War.
These are equivalent to today's modern dum-dum bullets. We have a sniper who's taken those round balls and hammered them down into cylinders. This would come out tumbling. And when it hits you, it would rip the flesh, rip the organs inside, and it does irreparable damage.
5 p.m., June 28th. Britain's finest are caught between fierce artillery fire and advancing American infantry. And elsewhere on the battlefield, the American lines hold. If this was the Americans' test, they aced it.
This is the first time that the main Continental Army saw the main British Army turn their backs and withdraw.
For the British, it's a serious setback. For von Steuben's troops schooled at Valley Forge, it's graduation day. But before the Americans can win a clear-cut victory, British forces withdraw to a camp half a mile away. The final outcome of the battle is still in doubt. But tomorrow, first light will reveal who the winners really are. At dawn, Washington and his troops arrive at the British camp. It's deserted. The English have slipped away in the night, forfeiting the victory to the Americans. It's a break for the Army and a breakthrough for their leader.
This is also a real milestone in Washington's career. After Monmouth, after this victory, there are no longer any questions. Washington is the undisputed commander-in-chief of the Continental Army.
With spring, the people of the colonies warm to their leader and his cause.
Valley Forge did more than transform the American Army. It also transformed the opinions of a lot of Americans who were civilians trying to make up their mind which way to go in this war.
In the afterglow of history, Valley Forge becomes a squeaky clean symbol of the American spirit. But for the men who went through the Crucible, it was about grinding hardships, not glory. Today, archaeologists are finding out just how difficult their ordeal really was.
They had tenacity, for want of a better word, of an army that refused to dissolve. Every scrap of evidence, every piece of metal, every bone fragment is just unbelievable testament to the sacrifice and devotion of these soldiers.
By the time the war is over, many who once thought Washington incompetent now want to crown him king. And England's King George is certain the American George will go for it.
When the war was over, George III was told by an American in London that Washington was planning to return to Mount Vernon. He wasn't going to become an Oliver Cromwell, a great dictator. And George said, "Sir, if he does that, he will be the greatest man in the world." And by God, he was.
And von Steuben? Washington promotes him to be the official Inspector General of the Army.
Washington grew so fond of von Steuben that it's no exaggeration to say that he was one of the 2 or 3 officers in the whole Army for which he had genuine fellow feeling.
Von Steuben built more than an army at Valley Forge. He also forged an enduring friendship with America's first commander-in-chief. After the war is finally won, Washington writes these words: "My dear Baron, I wish to make use of this last moment of my public life to express my sense of obligation the public is under for your faithful services. Your most obedient and affectionate, George Washington."